Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to thank Dominic for inviting me to serve as moderator this evening. And today's topic or debate is, does God exist? That's the question. And we will have two debaters. The bios are as such. Mr. Chiarello, a former Yale PhD fellow in philosophy with a master's of science in sociology of education from Oxford, national director of the humanitarian and ethics curriculum at Camp Quest, the co-founder of the Yale Humanist and the managing editor for Applied Sentience. Paul has conducted research on religion and politics with the United Nations and in Washington, D.C. And Mr. Keith Kendricks, the club advisor for Ratio Christi at Stockton and Stockton Christian Fellowship. He has a philosophy and religion degree from Biola University and is a fellow of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. Keith is also has a radio program, Evidence for Faith, for many years, and has a worldwide podcast audience. Now, the rules for the debate are as follows. There will be an opening, a rebuttal, and a concluding portion for each side of the debate. Since Mr. Kendricks is making the claim in the affirmative that God does exist, he will go first, and Mr. Chiarello will go second as he is debating the thesis, that thesis. The opening portion will be roughly 15 minutes for each debater, followed by the rebuttal portion, which will extend roughly 10 minutes for each side. The concluding portion will be 5 minutes, at which, when concluded, we will have about an hour dedicated for questions of the debaters by students and the audience. Have you ever asked yourself, does God exist? The question is the most primary of all primary questions. It is foundational to all the big questions of life. You see, all other questions of life are affected by your answer to the first question, does God exist? Other primary questions, such as where do we come from? What is the purpose of life? How can I be a good person? How can I be happy? Are all affected by the answer to the first question, does God exist? So before you commit yourself to some philosophy of life, it is important that you get the answer to the first question right if you want to have any hope of getting any of the answers right. But can anyone really know the answer to that first question? The secular pop culture of the day says that there is no evidence on either side. That is just a matter of choice or faith. Fortunately for you, you are going to be exposed to some of the arguments and evidence for and against the idea that God does, in fact, exist, and it may just change your life. Tonight, we will have the opportunity to hear a tiny part of some of the best arguments from both sides. There are many more evidences and arguments that could be presented, but it would take far too much time this evening because this question has been longly debated for thousands of years by some of the smartest human beings on our planet. And we have an abundance of information and contemplation to build on. So without further delay, we will begin with our debate and the opening remarks from Mr. Kendricks.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be participating in tonight's debate, and I feel privileged to be sharing the podium with such a distinguished student of philosophy as Paul Chiarello. From Plato and Aristotle's first denunciations of the atheism of their day and their evidences and arguments for the existence of God to the great Christian thinkers like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, and including great Jewish and Islamic philosophers like Al-Ghazali, and many other great thinkers up to the modern age. All these thinkers have added to our understanding of the many logical arguments that prove to us that God exists. In modern times, however, we also have a tremendous amount of scientific evidence that supports these philosophical arguments, so much so that in the past 50 years, the evidence has become so compelling that prominent atheists have converted to theism. Tonight, I'm going to give you 3 strong arguments that God exists. An argument based on the beginning of the universe, an argument based on the fine-tuning of the universe, and an argument based on the coded information found in the living cell. So, does God really exist? My first approach is to answer this question with the Kalam cosmological argument. And it goes like this: whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. But is this first premise true? Think about it. Oh, there we go. Can things come into existence without a cause? Believing that something like a universe or a rabbit can pop into existence without any cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic, because at least with magic, you've got a magician and a hat. And if something can pop into existence from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirms our first premise. If something begins to exist, then it must have a cause. Now, what about our second premise? Is it true? Did the universe begin to exist, or has it always existed? In the past, atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. According to the late atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell, quote, "The universe is just there and that's all." First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us that the universe is slowly running out of usable energy. But if the universe had been here forever, it would have already run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us clearly to a universe that had a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the redshift in light from distant galaxies. The empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. More recently, 3 leading cosmologists, Orvin Bord, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that, quote, "any universe which has, on average, been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have had an absolute beginning," close quote. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. According to Vilenkin, scientists, quote, "can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning," close quote. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of this argument are true. And that means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful. Much like, well, God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist. As a second proof that God exists, I want you to think about what has been learned in the last 20 years or so about the kind of universe that we live in. We now know that the universe itself is fine-tuned to allow life to exist. From galaxies and stars down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers: the speed of light, the gravitational constant, the mass of the electron, proton, and neutron, the cosmological constant, the Hubble constant. These and many more than 60 some odd, such numbers are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed in to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no planets, no life, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, 10 to the 14th, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began, 10 to the 20th. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life could not exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or another example of fine-tuning: if the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 raised to the 10th to the 120th parts, the universe would have been hostile to life of any kind. Now, each of these 60-plus constants are independent from each other, and so they must be multiplied times each other in order to calculate the total improbability of a universe such as ours existing. So you multiply one incredible improbability times another incredible improbability again and again and again until your mind is reeling with the gargantuan, mind-staggering unlikelihood of it all, revealing the universe's exquisite fine-tuning. Stephen Hawking said, quote, "The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life," close quote. So what is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to the explanation of physical necessity, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There is no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. Therefore, given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. For my third argument, let's now turn from the evidence in cosmology, astronomy, and physics to the amazing new discoveries in biology. Modern science shows us that the study of biology is largely a study of information science, as all living things contain vast libraries of information in the form of a genetic code called DNA. Committed atheists must believe for the origin of life to have occurred naturalistically, that a code system originated by chance with no outside intelligence. But experimental science has shown that this is false. Information is non-material. It is metaphysical. It's a metaphysical entity, and it has only been observed to be derived from an intelligent source. An example can be demonstrated simply. Pretend I take a piece of chalk and write on the board here. I guess that's not a blackboard, but a whiteboard. So imagine a blackboard and a piece of chalk. And I write, "Hi, my name is Keith." Now, if I asked you, where did the information come from? Would you say from the chalk? Or if I wiped the chalk off with my hand and showed you the chalk on my hand, would you say that there was information there? Right? No. Obviously, information was carried on the material of the chalk because of the arrangement. But chalk has no inherent information content. The information can be traced back to the mind, me, that formulated the message, not the matter, the calcium carbonate. Similarly, DNA is comprised of sugar, phosphates, and bases, but the matter that it is made up of does not contain the information. It's not in the DNA itself. It is in the arrangement that the information is contained. So information is first metaphysical. It is not part of the matter that it is carried on. And secondly, it has only ever been observed to be created by intelligence. Origin of life researcher David Abel admits the more honest we are about current discoveries within living things, the further away from naturalistic explanations we get. He says, quote, "Science has an obligation to be honest about what the entire body of evidence clearly suggests. We cannot just keep endlessly labeling abundant evidence of formal prescription in nature apparent. The fact of purposeful programming at multiple layers gets more apparent with each new issue of virtually every molecular biology journal," close quote. So for atheists, the ever-increasing accumulation of observable evidence is going in the wrong direction. All living things operate and replicate using vast quantities of coded information, which is stored, read, proofread, corrected, transcribed, edited, and finally translated. All of these processes shout out purposeful, intelligent, sophisticated programming, far more advanced than any technology we've yet conceived, not blind, purposeless, naturalistic processes. Aside from the fact that no one has ever observed a code system spontaneously generating it, it is even beyond our imagination to concoct a story of how matter could formulate such code. So far, the average layperson's belief that scientists have the origin of life figured out, the honest scientists who understand the problem are admitting that they don't know at all. But the problem is even more dire than most people know. Not only must the committed materialist believe that a code system spontaneously generated, but also believe that a translation system specific to that exact code must have also evolved through natural causes. The coded information in the DNA of living things is only useful when translated and expressed in specific structures and functions. This is truly a dizzying prospect, as the process of translation itself, in all of our experience, is another activity that can only be traced back to an intelligent source. We can construct an argument with this form. Coded information only comes from intelligent design. The living cell operates on coded information. Therefore, the living cell is intelligently designed. This argument is so powerful that atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel subtitled his latest book, "Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False." You have before you three strong philosophical and scientific arguments that God exists. In order for Mr. Chiarello to show that God does not exist, he will have to refute each of these arguments and then build arguments of his own that God does not exist. And until he does that, you have good, solid evidence to conclude that God does, in fact, exist.
Next up, we will have Mr. Chiarello debate that God does not exist.
So Thank you so much, Keith and Ratio Christie, for inviting me tonight. Thank you, Stockton University, and thank you everyone that came. I hope you enjoy the talk. So I wanted to start off with a little bit about myself and when I first started to think about, actually, could you change it to the slide? Oh, yeah. Started to think about this question, does God exist? So I grew up in a very conservative evangelical Christian family. And it wasn't until college, really, many of your ages, that I really made a lot of non-Christian friends. And as someone who was studying to be a Christian apologist myself, these new friends made a huge impact on my life and my views. Eventually, I started to question more deeply my own justification for my religion. How can I be justified in what I believe? Why do so many honest and intelligent people reject Christianity, all the new friends and professors that I was meeting? Why put my faith in one religion versus another? What if I was born into a Muslim or Hindu or humanist or some other family? So tonight I want to discuss one of the lesser well-known formal arguments against the existence of God. However, it's an extremely intuitive and often invoked argument. It's what grounds a lot of the questions that I just told you I asked as I was a college student myself. The name of this problem is called the problem of disagreement. Like every such argument, it refers to one specific kind of God. But I'll get into a little bit more of what I mean by that and define that God later. To begin with, before I introduce the problem itself, I'd like to say a bit about epistemology, or the study and theory of knowledge, just to give some background. So most of what we know through testimony. The reason that I know say Moscow is the capital of Russia is that my teachers told me and map makers have consistently put it there. I've never been there myself, never been to Moscow, and I don't know anything about cartography. Instead, I rely on the testimony of my teachers and map makers. However, what do you do when testimonies disagree? So say my fictional teacher, Mr. Flynn, told me that Moscow exports 1 million tons of grain for some particular year. Later on, so I believe him, and then later on, Miss Lawrence says that it's 2 million tons of grain for that same exact year. Now, they can't both be right because they contradict each other. So the easy answer to figure out which is a more reliable source of testimony is to ask some questions like which has a more extensive background in the subject. So Mr. Flynn, say, is a geography teacher, while Miss Lawrence teaches English. So Mr. Flynn's background may give him some hints that he might be more reliable for this kind of information. Or you can ask about their history or track record of being right or wrong. So to reverse it, say Mr. Flynn is a new teacher and very forgetful. He often has to check the book for the answer, while Miss Lawrence is absolutely brilliant and seems to just know everything. So you might say that that's a point for Miss Lawrence for the reliability of her testimony. But it gets really difficult and really interesting when the two disagreeing sources of testimony are equally reliable, when they have the same kind of track records and expertise in the subject and so forth. So what should we do? Should we go on believing in this example Mr. Flynn because he taught us first that it's I think I said 1 million tons? Is it a kind of first come, first serve kind of basis that we should believe things when testimonies disagree? Well, of course not. We have new information now, and we need to change or adjust our beliefs accordingly. So in response to observing the fact of disagreement, epistemologists, there's a consensus that we should lower our confidence that that particular belief is true. The greater the disagreement, the more we should suspend belief. So how does this apply to religion? Professors and priests who spend their lives studying theology and morality often disagree. There's tons and tons of disagreement. These professors and priests passionately and honestly disagree with each other. There's almost as many positions that you could take on religion, the existence of God, and so on, as there are experts to take them. Further, normal people who are just going about their daily lives also disagree. There's huge disagreement. If you were born, any of you, if you were born to a Muslim family, I assume many of you are Christian, But if you're born in a Muslim family, reverse it if you're Muslim, and a Muslim neighborhood, then you would probably be Muslim instead. Standing in front of you right now, well, standing and sitting, are two people who sincerely care about this issue. We really, care about the topic of the debate, which is not on the screen. So we really are concerned with the truth about whether or not God exists. But we passionately disagree about the answer to it. So the fact of the matter is that that disagreement about religion is very widespread. So how do we explain this fact, this observation about the world? Well, it's pretty easy for humanists like myself to explain it. In fact, given the humanist worldview, you would expect and predict widespread disagreement. First, religion and morality are extremely difficult and extremely complex issues, probably the most difficult and complex that we'll face during our lives. And second, we have a limited amount of experience over a very short lifespan and often err in our reasoning. So we would expect people, even the best of us, to disagree on the subject. Further, I hope more people recognize this widespread disagreement. I think it's a good thing. I hope more people, like I said, recognize it. I hope that it inspires tolerance of others, as it has with me, as well as humility when we recognize how easily we might be wrong. If we all recognize this, I think that maybe we could end a lot of the religious violence that we see increasing today, actually. Unfortunately for Christians, the fact of disagreement, the disagreement is so widespread, is not as easy to explain. As a side note, by the way, I'm going to focus on Christianity for the rest of my talk. But this is only because of cultural familiarity, both for myself, audience, and Keith, representing Evangelical Christian Organization. But these ideas equally apply to Islam and many other religions. But back to my argument. So, given the Christian kind of God, we would expect disagreement not to exist. We would expect agreement. So since there is disagreement, we can conclude there's no such God. It's if X, then Y, not Y, therefore not X. Kind of logical. Specifically, what kind of God am I talking about? Well, the kind of God I'm talking about has two characteristics. First, it's a God who wants us to know X. He wants us to know something, he or she. Wants us to know something, whatever it is. It changes by different religions, that Jesus is Christ or that Muhammad is prophet. Minimally, God usually wants us to know that God exists. The question of the debate still. So whatever that is, however you cash that out, God wants us to know something. Two, God is omnipotent. So why, given this kind of God, will we not expect disagreement? Well, because such a God would both be willing, would want to, and be able to give us all sufficient evidence so that we can believe X, so that we can make an informed decision. And he would make it so that all the evidence clearly points in one direction. So because God loves us, and he wants us to know him or about Jesus or whatever else, he would do all he can to help us in our search for truth so that we can at very least make an informed decision. And if we all have the same evidence pointing in the same direction, then we would generally agree. So I'm sure that some of you are already thinking about various replies to this, to the problem of disagreement. Keith's writing them down right now. So I want to quickly go over 3 common answers. The first is what I call the liberal answer. And this argues that God is love, God is community, or the ideal of justice, or something like that. God is redefined in some way. He is now not the kind of thing that wants. So that's the first premise. It's not the kind of thing that wants anything, but instead some ideal or something that we value. If Keith uses this definition of God, then I actually can see the debate, because I believe that love exists. I believe that community exists. I believe these things are important. According to this particular definition, I would be a theist. However, I think this semantic argument confuses the issue. And historically, and even today as well, most people don't use this definition of God. And I think we're better off just calling love, love, and so on. A more interesting defense that focuses on one of the more common understandings of God is often known as fideism, if I'm saying that right. Good. Since it values faith. In this family of answers, and I'm going to generalize, in this family of answers, God is often referred to as hidden. So there's, cashed out in a bunch of different ways. Either that God created a universe without evidence, or God actually hides the evidence, or God muddles the facts so they point in various directions, or allows Satan to muddle the facts. So why would God do this? Well, faith is much more valuable. Believing on faith is much more valuable than believing on evidence. So God wants us to believe on faith, so he makes it so that it's not quite clear. So think the doubting Thomas story. So there are at least 4 problems with fideism. First, if Keith takes this approach, I've automatically won the debate. Because debates are about presenting evidence, this approach argues that there is no evidence or it's inconclusive, and therefore there's nothing really to say. Second, this approach relies on a false dichotomy, or is often set up in such a way. Often it's discussed between a choice between faith in one religion and atheism. But there are tons of religions you could put your faith into. So how do you decide which religion to have faith in? Without being arbitrary and showing special preference and things like that, of course. You need something impartial that's separate from those religions to help you decide. And that impartial thing, separate from faith, that's what evidence is. Third, it just doesn't seem to make sense given other doctrines about God. For instance, free will plays an enormous part in the problem of evil. God, above all, wants us to choose him and his gift of salvation, and, if so, the minimal requirement needed to choose is to be fully informed about what the options are. So imagine I offer you some candy and you take it. I tell you it doesn't have peanuts since you are really allergic to them. However, it does. You can't say that person chose to eat candy with peanuts in it. Why not? Because they weren't fully informed about what the options were. Similarly, if the importance of free will and of choosing or rejecting God is so important, then we all must be fully informed about the nature of our choice. Minimally, we all must be fully aware that God exists. Fourth, this approach is not scriptural. Now, for some of you, this won't matter too much, but for those Christians in the audience where that is important, I thought I'd bring that up, and I'll get to it a little bit in a moment. So, what is the classic scriptural defense against the problem of disagreement? In short, it's the claim that non-Christians are universally, willingly ignorant and selfish. Simply put, there's no disagreement in what we actually believe. There's only disagreement in what we say we believe, and what non-Christians say we believe. In our heart of hearts, we know, for instance, that God exists. So the disagreement we observe is superficial and isn't actually there. We're all just selfishly ignoring the fact that we really know to be true. So I've said this view isn't scriptural. So I'd like to quickly, in the short amount of time I have remaining, go over a few passages. Actually, I have to skip a few. Jesus says, for instance, in Matthew 7, "Seek and ye shall find, for whoever seeks finds." This is very clear. Jesus says that anyone who seeks will find him, because he is the way, the truth, and the life. So if someone hasn't found Jesus, then they just haven't searched. Romans 1 says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen so that people are without excuse." So can I go a tiny bit over? No? Okay. So I want to end with a very, very quick challenge. I would like everyone to go home, read Romans 1, read it in its entirety, and then go out and make as many friends with non-Christians as you possibly can. and judge its truth for yourself. See if they really are in their heart of hearts believe that God exists or whatever that is, and whether they really do disagree with it. See if they're honest. I believe that's that. Sorry. All right.
You still have,
What?
still have time. You still have
Oh, my.
Now
Okay,
you don't.
yeah. No. Okay, yeah. All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Can we get another round of applause for the two of them? Okay, next we will be following up with a rebuttal portion that will extend roughly 10 minutes for each side. So we will have our Mr. Kendricks come back up.
Okay. Well, in my opening remarks, I gave you 3 strong philosophical and scientific arguments that God exists. The fact of the beginning of the universe, the fact of the fine-tuning of the universe, and the fact of the coded information found in the living cell. In his opening remarks, Mr. Chiarello had the responsibility of giving you arguments that show you that God does not exist. And he did attempt that with the argument of disagreement. But I would like to point out that it seems pretty clear to me that this is simply a non sequitur. Right? It does not follow from the mere fact that there is disagreement about what God is there or if God is there, that necessarily entails that God does not exist. I mean, think about the other kinds of things that there is disagreement about. For hundreds of years, it was argued whether the earth went around the sun or the sun went around the earth, and it was a very intense argument. But that is not to say that there is no earth, there is no sun, or it isn't a fact that one does go around the other, right? Or the idea of continental drift, not long ago, was a huge scientific problem and great debate that took 80 years to resolve. Okay, does that mean that there are no continents or that there is no such thing as continental drift just because there was a large disagreement about it? It seems to me that the more important the topic, the more disagreement there is. Look at the world of economics, right? There has been now for almost a century a tremendous argument between Keynesianism and free market economics. And it doesn't seem that there's going to be any end to this argument. This is essentially endless because the results is too important. It matters too much to people what the answer is. So if you then go to an even more important realm of religion on whether or not God exists, this is probably the most important question. So it is seems obvious to me that there would be even more disagreement. So the argument he's making is that God wants us to know and that God is omnipotent and therefore we ought to know. Again, it does not follow that God does not exist. What if God doesn't want us to know? Right? I mean, that's certainly one of the possibilities. He also, I believe, made a philosophical error in that he's created a false dichotomy. He's created 3 possible answers that he enunciated and shared the problems of each one. But it is not necessarily true that you must pick only one of those answers. Why can't you say that it's actually partly that God wants to suppress some of the truth so that those who could only be convinced by strenuous amounts of argumentation, maybe he's not interested in converting them that way, right? By essentially intellectual force. And partly it's fideism, right? So that it could be parts of both. So again, I simply claim that he has not presented you with any a really strong argument. This seems to me that this is not a strong argument at all. So let me go to another reason why one ought to realize that atheism is false. And that's because atheism is self-refuting. Atheism actually undercuts rationality. A major way to test a philosophy or a worldview is to ask, is it logically consistent? Internal contradictions are fatal to any worldview because contradictory statements are necessarily false. A square circle is contradictory, so it has to be false. An especially damaging form of contradiction is self-referential absurdity, which means that a theory sets up a definition of truth that it itself fails to meet. Therefore, it refutes itself. An example of self-referential absurdity is a theory called evolutionary epistemology, a naturalistic approach that applies evolution to the process of knowing. The theory proposes that the human mind is a product of natural selection. The implication is that the ideas in our minds were selected for their survival value and not for their truth value. But what if we apply the theory to itself? Then it too was selected for survival and not for truth, which discredits its own claim to truth. Evolutionary epistemology commits suicide. Astonishingly, many prominent thinkers have embraced the theory without detecting the logical contradiction. Philosopher John Gray writes, quote, "If Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, the human mind serves evolutionary success and not truth," close quote. What is the contradiction in that statement? He expects you to believe that that statement is true. Gray has essentially said if Darwin's theory is true, then it, quote, serves evolutionary success and not truth. In other words, if Darwin's theory is true, then it is not true. Self-referential absurdity is akin to the well-known liar's paradox. This statement is a lie. If the statement is true, then as it says, it is not true, but it's a lie. Another example comes from Francis Crick. In his book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, he writes, quote, "Our highly developed brains, after all, were not evolved under the pressure of discovering scientific truths, but only to enable us to be clever enough to survive. But that means that Crick's own theory is not a scientific truth. Applied to itself, the theory commits suicide. Of course, the sheer pressure to survive is likely to produce some correct ideas. A zebra that thinks lions are friendly will not live long. But false ideas may be useful for survival. Evolutionists admit as much. Eric Baum says, quote, "Sometimes you are more likely to survive and propagate if you believe a falsehood than if you believe the truth," close quote. Steven Pinker writes, quote, "Our brains were shaped for fitness, not for truth. Sometimes the truth is adaptive, but sometimes it is not," close quote. The upshot is that survival is no guarantee of truth. If survival is the only standard, we can never know which ideas are true and which are adaptive but false. To make the dilemma even more puzzling, evolutionists tell us that natural selection has produced all sorts of false concepts in the human mind. Many evolutionary materialists maintain that free will is an illusion, consciousness is an illusion, even our sense of self is an illusion, and that all these false ideas were selected for their survival value. So how can we know whether the theory of evolution itself is one of those false ideas? The theory undercuts itself. A few thinkers, to their credit, recognize the problem. Literary critic Leon Wellsetter writes, quote, "If reason is a product of natural selection, then how much confidence can we have in a rational argument for natural selection? Evolutionary biology cannot invoke the power of reason, even as it destroys it," close quote. On a similar note, philosopher Thomas Nagel asks, quote, "Is the evolutionary hypothesis really compatible with the continued confidence in reason as a source of knowledge?" His answer is no. Quote, "I have to be able to believe that I follow the rules of logic because they are correct, not merely because I am biologically programmed to do so. Hence," he says, quote, "insofar as the evolutionary hypothesis itself depends on reason, it would be self-undermining," close quote. Applied consistently, Darwinism undercuts not only itself, but also the entire scientific enterprise. Kenan Malik, a writer trained in neurobiology, writes, quote, "If our cognitive capacities were simply evolved dispositions, there would be no way of knowing which of these capacities lead to true beliefs and which to false ones. Thus, quote, to view humans as little more than sophisticated animals undermines confidence in the scientific method," close quote. Just so, science itself is at stake. John Lennox, professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, writes that according to atheism, quote, "the mind that does science is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Now, if you know your computer was the product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? So to me, atheism undermines the rationality that I need to do science," close quote. Of course, the atheist pursuing his research has no choice but to rely on rationality, just as everyone else does. Thank you.
Oh, my,
Please,
okay.
rebuttal.
Yes, I'm very, very eager. Okay, great. So I'm really surprised, actually, that Keith says that this is not a strong argument. It actually sounds to me as if he hasn't heard it before. When I was at Yale studying for my PhD, they made a new hire, a joint position with the Yale Divinity School and Philosophy Department, and the new hire, for part of his interview, gave a lecture on the problem of disagreement. I was recently, about a week ago, talking with one of my friends at the Yale Divinity School, who's also in the joint program with philosophy, and we were discussing what arguments to kind of put forward in a limited amount of time, and he agreed with me that the problem of disagreement is one of the most powerful. So I thought that Keith was going to take one of the three problems. By the way, it's not false dichotomy. If you have three options, false trichotomy, but anyway. So I was thinking that he would take one of those options, but I'm surprised. So, for instance, he brought up the example of disagreement about geocentrism versus heliocentrism, but that's just a completely different kind of thing. God. I said one of my premises that God wants us to know X. He wants us to know X. Does He want us to know X? No. I mean, you don't read the Bible to read Revelation about the truth of heliocentrism or geocentrism. Also, some people think you do. God's not holding our hand because He's really, really concerned that we, come to know the truth about heliocentrism. He's just not concerned. But I think it's a different kind of thing of whether God exists. The classic God of Christianity and Islam and so on, that God is really, really concerned. I mean, the whole purpose of history is basically to come to know the truth that God exists, that His Son died for our sins, or whatever else you think is important. Heliocentrism is just completely unimportant. It's just this mere little fact. Yeah, people disagree with it, and God didn't step in to clear the issue because it just doesn't matter. But the absence of God stepping in to clear this really honest, heartfelt disagreement by people who are really trying to figure out the truth. People are really trying to figure out the truth of whether or not God exists. And the fact that people come to such wide variety of conclusions is an interesting thing, especially in light of passages like Romans 1, which I read. So Romans 1, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen so that people are without excuse. God is holding us accountable for knowing He exists. We go to hell if we don't accept the free gift of salvation. We don't go to hell. He's not showing since the beginning of the world that heliocentrism is true. These are completely different kinds of things, and I'm really shocked that that difference wasn't seen. How much time do I have? And can you raise this up? 7 minutes. All right, that's good. That's fine. So he mentioned abiogenesis. So my background is in epistemology and ethics. And so I was hoping you wouldn't get into some of the metaphysical arguments for God's existence, and I could stick within my specialty. But abiogenesis, I really enjoy evolution. I think it's very interesting. So he said that there's a problem about information starting in a natural way. So I want to go over one of my favorite theories of abiogenesis. So a lipid has two parts. It has a hydrophilic, means it likes water, and hydrophobic part. This is a naturally occurring organic molecule. If you take a whole bunch of them in a mixture and you shake them around very vigorously, they spontaneously form certain patterns. They'll actually do, they'll pair up in a circle, and then you'll actually have they'll do the same thing on the inside. So you'll have H2O and H2O, because this side likes water and this side really hates it, does everything it can to get away from it. So a natural solution is that they kind of bond in this way so that these sides can protect themselves against water and these guys can get all the water they want. So you form, this is called a lipid bilayer, naturally occurring organic molecule. This is actually what, more or less, like kind of what our cells are made of. So this is interesting. So we have these, kind of really early cell, and this is nothing but the most simple organic molecules. You have a very early kind of cell forming completely from mechanical processes, and like I said, this internal part of the cell keeps a lot of stuff out. However, it doesn't keep everything out. Some little particles can get through. So, the triangles can get through, the circles can't. So, you'll get, slowly over time, you get triangles on the inside here, and, circles will stay out. Amino acids and other nucleotides, some other organic compounds, can get through. So these nucleotides, they just kind of hang out, they do their thing, but slowly can also, especially within the protection of the lipid bilayer, for protection from all the outside chaotic stuff, can form strings together. Now they're basically useless. They don't do anything. Like I said, there's no information. However, they can be selected for. For instance, if they can form longer chains, they can give some more internal structure to the cell to keep it, keep it going, to keep it from, just breaking apart. So certain kinds of structures now help the cell. They're not actively helping, obviously. They're just, forming differently in the chaotic world. When they can form, how much time do I have? Okay, so I'll leave it at that. But anyway, this is just like a way that this spontaneously goes, and then you start to get a cell formation with nucleotides forming patterns where some patterns are better than other. They get selected for over time. DNA. That's the very, very short version, the intro. So I wanted to say a couple quick things. A universe from nothing. Keith says that we would see this all the time. We do see it all the time, just not in the real world. We see it in quantum mechanics. He says that whatever created the world must be spaceless. No, we can easily imagine CERN, scientists in the CERN reactor creating a black hole in some other parallel universe. They would be very much based in space. Unimaginably powerful? No, it would only need to be logically. It would only need to be powerful enough to create a universe. In fact, it could only even have one function: universe creating, and that power could have been completely exhausted after he created one universe. Timeless? Again, no. We could easily imagine that such a being created the universe and died, and maybe even died of exhaustion after creating universes. It must be tough creating universes. Similarly, the fine tuning is a false dichotomy. Usually sets it up between two options: either there's life or there's no life. But there may be many other kinds of life. There's actually a game, I'm blanking, I think the name of it is actually called Life. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so you know the one I'm talking about. Yeah, and you can get certain types of rhythmic patterns of behavior from things that are non-biological at all. We may need, for the kind of life with the kind of matter that we are, yes, we need this one universe, but there's nothing to say that there's not other possible universes that create the same kind of life, or that there's, you change them up to something different than some other kind of life. And then this also completely ignores the various theories for multiverses, the anthropic principle. I could list the keywords for things that are replies to these kinds of arguments. What else do I want to say? Oh yeah, quick thing. Anthony Flew, the theist that he mentioned the deathbed conversion with the book There Is No God. Anthony Flew actually co-wrote that book because he had been diagnosed several years later with Alzheimer's, which he died from complications of Alzheimer's about a year or two after he wrote that book. So it's not the best deathbed conversion philosopher guide to point to. And I think that's all my notes. Another time? Okay. A minute and a half? What else do you want to know? I talk pretty quickly, as you might know. So Yeah, I mean, a lot of the arguments that really struck me, the fine-tuning, how do you explain the start of a universe? How do you explain life? That, oh, well, there can't be that, so it must be God, because God's, classically filled this role. Well, God's classically filled tons and tons and tons of roles. And we've been knocking them off the list fairly regularly. And even though I can only give some kind of basic outlines for abiogenesis, we haven't figured it all out yet, I'm pretty confident that we're learning. And you mentioned that Christianity, that atheism is not a good kind of intellectual spur for science. But it seems that if we were going to take the God did it answer to why the universe exists, we'd already have our answer, and we wouldn't be looking into science anymore. The epistemic materialism is kind of the suggestion, the assumption that any answer we might have, maybe God did, but let's look into it to see if it's not God. So if we rely on the kind of answers that Keith has given, we're going to lose that curiosity of, well, maybe God didn't do it. Maybe there is a natural explanation. And I think actual materialism is a much better fuel for epistemic materialism. Okay, thank you.
Can we give him another round of applause? So this evening, we've had the opening and rebuttal on both sides of the debate. Does God exist? At this point in time, we will be going on with our concluding portion, 5 minutes to each of the debaters. And Mr. Kendricks, please.
Okay. Well, this is a terrific debate. I love this. So far tonight, it's my opinion we have not seen any good evidence to think that God does not exist. Mr. Chiarello had an opportunity to present an argument, which I maintain remains a non sequitur. It does not follow that God does not exist just because there is a lot of disagreement about it. One of the possible solutions is that God does want us to search for him. It seems like that fits pretty reasonably into why God might make it not so easy for us or force us by intellectual overpowering us. His job also was to tear down my 3 arguments. For the beginning of the universe shows that God exists. The fine-tuning of the universe shows that God exists, and the information present in living cells shows that God exists. Now, let me address what he talked about, saying that essentially I was using a God of the gaps argument. By the way, let's see. Let's go back to, oops. He wasn't on his deathbed when he wrote the book.
I said 2 years, died 2 years later.
Okay, just for clarity, there we go. 2 years later, and he was within his wits. He actually was, according to him, completely converted by the evidence for fine-tuning of the universe. Let me jump forward, though. Okay. All right, let's talk about the multiverse quickly. In an effort to keep an option alive of fine-tuning being the result of mere chance, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator or a process of some kind that cranks out a vast number of universes that, odds are life permitting, that a life-permitting universe will eventually pop out. However, there is absolutely no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, this is why even if there is a multiverse, it still does not answer the fine-tuning question. Small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one inhabited by a single simple observer. This is known by physicists as the Boltzmann brain. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we would least expect, even in a multiverse. A vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe inhabited by billions of other observers. We, the observers, are far over-engineered for the simple purpose of observing that there is a fine-tuned universe that happens to exist. Another incredibly unlikely event. So even if the multiverse exists and there is no evidence for it, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. All right, time? Let me jump to, I'm sorry, how much? 1 minute. Okay, very good. All right. So abiogenesis. Prior to life, anything that happens cannot be selected for by natural selection because you don't have reproduction, you don't have what we would think of as evolution going on. There are two accidents that get frozen in time for life to exist. One is the genetic code, and the other is the 20 amino acids that life is based on. There are hundreds of amino acids, right? So why are there only 20? They were, according to evolutionists, they had to be accidentally frozen in time right at the beginning. But we know that these 20 amino acids actually are the optimal 20. From the hundreds of amino acids that exist, these are the perfect 20 that someone would choose if you were intelligently designing life. You would pick these 20 because they provide the widest range of biochemical properties. The genetic code, 1 out of 10 to the 84th possibility for it to be the right one, and it is.
Okay. So again, I'm confused. He started out saying that it wasn't a problem, but then offered a possible solution to this non-problem. He mentioned that God may not have wanted to intellectually overpower us. This falls under my, more or less the fideism kind of explanation, so I've addressed that with at least 4 arguments. But it's also just a complete straw man. Like, God doesn't need to intellectually overpower us with tons and tons of information so that we and restrict any possible counter evidence or anything like that. I'm not arguing for that. I'm simply saying that if God wants us to know something, and He's omnipotent, so He can, help us along, God would, give us the bare minimum, simply so that we can make an informed decision. God says, "Seek and ye shall find, for whoever seeks finds." Why? Because God's like, He's really interested. Oh, you're really looking, you're trying to figure this out? Great, come here, I'll show you. If you're really interested in the truth, I'll help you along, because I'm really concerned that you know the truth, namely that I exist. That's the story. Like, it follows a very clear pattern of, if there is, a certain kind of God, sorry, Kate, then we would expect no disagreement, right? That's a better notation. We would expect there not to be disagreement, right? But we have disagreement, so therefore, there's not that kind of God. And, it follows a very, very simple kind of logical form. And it seems that, at least you were playing the game when you said, here's a possible solution, that, God's not trying to intellectually overpower us, so that's why He's not giving us any evidence that clearly points to it. But I'm not exactly sure how to explain it any simpler almost. So let's see. What was the other thing that So, oops. According to the amino acids, again, you know, this is a, it's now covered, but this kind of process would set up a basic natural selection to get the kinds of amino acids that you need and in the kind of form that you need. This kind of lipid bilayer can grow. It has the ability to grow, one characteristic of life, by simply adding other lipids that are in the environment. It has the ability to reproduce because it fissions, it splits in half in some mechanical force acting on the outside. Imagine some wind, and, you know, hits a rock and then splits. So therefore, it you know, divides, it reproduces. And there's variation. You know, different lipid bilayers over their life will change in the ratio and in the way that their amino acids connect. So there's variation in heritable material because the amino acids will split when it fissions. I mean, those are, I may be missing one while I'm, you know, thinking about this quickly, but those are all the basic ideas for life. So this lipid bilayer that has amino acids that affect how it grows, and therefore, you know, ones that grow more quickly are able to, you know, fission more and make, or ones that have a system that is more amenable to attracting lipids in the environment will, you know, similarly grow, and they'll take more lipids from other ones that don't have a mixture of amino acids. And I mean, that's the basics. That's the basics far before the kind of impossible numbers that Keith is talking about with DNA chains. DNA chains are incredibly complex. So yeah, we do expect them further down, you know, the evolutionary timeline. Here's something that's much sooner that natural selection can work on, and that doesn't have the insane probabilities. So that's it.
Now that we've had the concluding portion on both sides, we will open up the floor for half an hour to an hour of questions and answers of the debaters by students in the audience and any visitors within the audience.
So my question is geared more to Paul.
Okay.
So I remember when he was talking about, you know, he was explaining his view, he was talking about evil. So a person might ask, you know, who determines evil? Is it the person, the family, parents, or society? I hear a lot of atheists say it's more for the common good of the society. But see, the thing is animals murder and rape all the time. Animals die of starvation all the time. It's not considered evil, it's just a way of life. So, I mean, my thing is, if there is no God, then who is to say that there is evil? In history, you have the Mayans. They used to sacrifice people, you know, to the gods so that, you know, the fields would grow. The Nazis felt it was the common good to kill off the Jews. You have ISIS now, who are killing whoever doesn't convert. We clearly know that these things are wrong. Now, as Paul was talking about how, you know, the lipid bilayers, if we're just like this, if we are just animals and just chemicals just randomly put together, reacting on our basic instincts, then who, you know, wait, hold on, sorry, I was writing this, hold on. If we're just, you know, animals and just coming on our basic instincts. I mean, animals die all the time. Why are chemicals worrying about what other chemicals are doing? You know, are animals wrong in the society for rape? Are animals wrong for genocide? A lion actually kills its baby cubs if it's a male. Animals rape a lion rapes a lioness all the time. And I'm sure there's been history in the world where in other countries, 40-year-old men are allowed to marry 10-year-old women. The idea that children are dying from starvation is just a way of life. Why worry about it? They're just animals. Animals die of starvation all the time. So my question is, where do we get these morals from that we know that rape, genocide, and pedophilia are wrong from an atheistic point of view?
So there are two things that you seem to have brought up. The first is cultural relativism, and the second is any kind of difference between animals and ourselves. I'll address the animal one first. So animals, kill, and we kill. Is there any difference? Is it all the same? Are we just animals? Blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, obviously there is a difference. There's a very easy to observe difference. Take a baby. If say, I have a little kid and he comes to your house and he comes over and he knocks over a lamp, really, really young kid, knocks over a lamp. Are you going to hold him accountable? No. Now say I come into your house and I come in and I walk around your house and then I just knock over a lamp. Are you going to hold me accountable? Yes. The difference? Well, because we can reason about these things differently. I can engage in perspective taking. I can understand the value that you place on that. I can operate according to social norms and rules of society that we set up so that we can manage conflicts that we have. Property rights is one of those things that we help to manage conflicts. Can a lion understand social norms and operate? Can they engage in perspective taking? Can they organize themselves based on social norms and rules so that they can manage the conflicts they have? No. I mean, this is the one of the most easy to observe things, and obviously relevant to why it's different if a lion kills than if I kill. Second, cultural relativism. Similarly, going on the whole social norms and all this kind of stuff, female genital mutilation, turns out, doesn't really add a lot to a flourishing society. Slavery, again, doesn't quite work too well. Owning other people is not something that's very conducive to that. There are certain things, certain norms, certain character traits, certain whatever else you want, that help produce flourishing, both for the personal level and the social level. I suggest reading Rawls' Rawls' Veil of Ignorance and Contractarianism, Aristotle and Neo-Virtue Ethics. Things like these discuss these issues. Scientifically, obviously read Positive Psychology, which goes into specifically what kind of traits, rules, norms, so on. In positive psychology, specifically character traits, reliably produce flourishing.
All right, so the issue of morals, the fact that we know that morals exist, in my mind, is proof that God does exist, and you can develop a simple syllogism for this. First, if God does not exist, then moral duties do not exist. Number two, moral duties do exist. We know that certain things like rape and slavery and pedophilia are truly wrong. Therefore, God exists. Now, Paul mentioned human flourishing as a guide to knowing what is right and wrong, but Casper was actually asking a different question. He was not asking, how do we know what is right and wrong, right? Or how do we define it? So Paul would say we define it as that which is good. That's how we define it. The question is, why is there a right and wrong at all in the first place? And my answer is that without God, there would not be any right or wrong.
I have a babillion questions, but I will. Yeah, I will just ask one. So I have been a Christian since I was 5 years old. Grew up at the same denomination as Paul, actually, and I've been a missionary for going on 11 years now, and I've spent a lot of time with unbelievers and sharing the gospel with unbelievers. Sorry, I shouldn't say unbelievers. I should say non-Christians, because I'm a Christian missionary. And I have never, in all the conversations I've had with atheists, ever come across an atheist that didn't at some point in their life decide that there was no God. And so my question would be, have you ever known an atheist that didn't at some point in their life come to the decision that there is no God? And if not, then that would be my, then I would wonder how you would address Romans 1 in light of that. So does my question make sense?
I'm not exactly sure.
Okay. So if every atheist at some point in their life decides, there is no God, right? That means that the natural inclination is to believe that there is a God, but you come to a logical conclusion at some point in your life.
You mean even every atheist starts off with belief in God?
Yeah. So there's a natural bent in our nature toward a belief in God, right?
Okay.
And so that's Romans 1, that we are without excuse. God is revealed. So that would be my question to you.
Okay. I mean, I don't see quite how that follows, but because it's more about them being honest with themselves. So Romans 1 says that, say we all start off with a belief in God, and then there's maybe evolutionary psychology reasons for this. The gods are used as, one step up on social hierarchies, and we're incredibly, social hierarchical. So, I mean, there's different answers for that, way you just start off with it. But regardless, Romans 1 is about us all having sufficient evidence. Evidence is clearly seen, so that we are without excuse. So the point is that if an atheist rejects this belief they start off with, whatever the cause of starting off with it, Romans 1 says that they actually know in their heart of hearts. It's clearly seen. But besides that, I mean, I've met tons of atheists that never start off believing. There might be a selection bias because those that start off with a belief are and then are going through doubt are going to be more likely to come to you. But those who never started with that belief, they're just going to kind of go on. A lot of non-Christians that I meet that don't start off with that belief. They're just, oh yeah, no, the world makes sense. May more or less make sense without a God, and that's that. And they just go on with their life. So it may be a bit of a selection bias why you've only come across non-Christians that start off with belief in God.
Well, actually, you might be interested in a little bit of scientific studies on this very question. Child development. Neurobiologists have looked at the development of the idea of God versus atheism, and what they find is that children naturally do believe in God, and it's part of the faculty of the mind, the brain, to recognize other beings. So when a child develops that, unless there is something wrong, autism, other types of brain deformities, a child will naturally be able to recognize that there are other minds. So when the child is interacting with its mother, it recognizes the mother as another being. And that ability of the brain leads naturally to recognizing the mind behind the universe. So it actually is true that the base starting point is theism, and later that is given up unless there is issues in brain development. And that's not an ad hominem. The studies were done by atheists. This is their findings.
Paul, earlier you talked about testimony being evidence when you were referencing teachers and such, and I can only speak to my own experiences as personal facts, so that's how I'll relay them. But as a new Christian, I feel that I have found evidence of truth, and in Christianity specifically, otherwise I never would have given up my past beliefs as a devout and learned Zionist Jew who lived in Israel. With this being said, there is a difference between beliefs and facts, and just because people don't all understand or agree does not mean that God is any less omnipotent. Simply because God knows all does not imply that we all accept this or him, and even more so, your suggestion to make non-Christian friends is pretty much irrelevant to me, in my opinion, no disrespect. There are lots of people who claim they know Jesus is their Lord and Savior, but they still do not follow his wishes. So just because people believe he died on the cross for their sins, it doesn't mean they've accepted him, and certainly not his teachings. So if they continue to go on sinning and living their lives led by money, lust, or anything above him, they don't follow him. They'll never truly know him or understand him, and certainly never receive eternal life through him. It's not, I've got a question, thank you. It's not through works, it's not through knowledge or education that you gain him or an understanding of him. So my question is, I want to know what you have done to truly gain knowledge of him, understand him personally, and try to prove to yourself that he does exist before you use science to prove that he does not exist.
I actually really like this question. I spent many years before I was an atheist. I grew up as a Christian. I was a young Earth creationist. I had studied. I'd been to denominations across Protestantism, Catholicism. I've been to Mass with the Pope, actually. I've been to mosques. I've been to Hindu temples. I've been to many different Buddhist orders. I've read most every major religious text. I've read apologetic works by Muslims about Islam and by Hindus about Hinduism, and by Christians about Christianity. I actually was talking about Josh McDowell. I usually read about 6 books at a time. I like to flit around. So I usually read a bunch of books at a time, and I always make sure that one of them is a book on Christian apologetics, or some other apologetics, but Christian apologetics are much more readily available. I could go on and on. I mean, those are all more intellectual things, and it seemed like you weren't particularly concerned about it. So there's lots of other different epistemic ways. So I like to talk about evidence because I think it's a little broader, but something even broader, a decision-making procedure. So, I read books on apologetics, but I also make sure to go to all the different religious sites, temples and mosques and so forth that I mentioned. I make sure to pray. I tried, praying with many different religions. I make sure to do the various religious practices. I've fasted for the whole month of Ramadan several times. I've partaken in Bible study and fellowship with Muslims. I've done Buddhist meditation. I've also studied the various academic theories like sensus divinitatis, Alvin Plantinga. I'm sure you're familiar with that. I could go on and on. This is something that I very consciously made sure to do as exhaustive of a study as possible. I grew up as an evangelical Christian, where I've said to people the same kind of thing, like, oh, you're being too intellectual about it, and it's part of like your heart. It's part about feeling comfortable and so on and on and on. I've had lots of people say to me that, oh, you just haven't been to the right church, when I've been to several times as many churches as they've ever been into. So thank you for allowing me to go on that little rant.
Okay, my question is sort of about the problem of disagreement. I just want to understand it a little better, because I felt like that was really, your main argument.
Yep.
And I feel like with the example that you used, with the conflicting reports about the amount of wheat, for example, or grain, whatever it was, when people disagree, it raises your level of doubt about, that's correct, right? About when you approach the problem.
What epistemologists call your credence.
Right.
Your confidence in that belief.
Right. So by that logic, if you apply it to the question that is in the debate tonight, wouldn't that, I feel like at best that would lead someone to a position of agnosticism rather than atheism, because they're coming at the question and just doubting the matter rather than taking a position one way or another. And so sort of a related question is, and I think to both debaters, are you 100% sure, or how would you rate your belief that your position is true?
Okay. May I go first to clarify? And then answer the second? Okay. Well, I thought you asked both of us about how sure we are, our credence levels. So yes, very astute. I was actually wanting to get into that distinction, but I originally thought I had 30 minutes to give this talk, and squeeze it into 15. So yes, initially you should lower it in somewhat of an argument for agnosticism, but then the problem of disagreement is separate. So the problem with disagreement says that there is a subset of gods, certain kind of gods. So some gods don't really care. So deistic gods, just they couldn't care what we believe. They created the universe and then just went off maybe to create more universes. Or the kind of evil demon gods, the Descartes kind, that just want to mess with us. So they want us to know something, but they want us to be wrong about that something. So there's various different kinds of gods, and this responds to a certain subset of those. And it says that given this kind of God, we would predict agreement. So disagreement is it's a fact about the world. We can go out and we can observe that people disagree. It could have been otherwise. We could have gone out and be like, I don't know, do people agree or not? We go out in the world and we say, oh, they agree. But we don't. We say, oh, do people disagree or not? We step outside, we look around, and we say, oh, there's an amazing amount of disagreement. So it's just a fact about the world. How do we explain that fact? I said humanists can easily explain it. But my point was, given the Christian kind of God, and it's a God broader than that, but I use Christianity for familiarity's sake. Given that kind of God, we would expect no disagreement. There is disagreement. There is not that kind of God. So that is the argument. If I just left off at disagreement with my kind of background to epistemology, then we would say, like, okay, we should just be agnostic. So concerning atheism, I've ruled out a very large number of gods. I've ruled out the ones that I think are important. Gods like the evil demon that's just trying to mess with us. I don't think there's any way we can actually, to go back to your point about how we know things. If an evil demon made my consciousness, there's no way I could disprove him because he's omnipotent. He could just make it so that it looks like he does or doesn't exist or whatever else. So there are a subset of gods like the evil demon god that might exist, but I'm just not particularly concerned about them. So with the gods I am concerned about, I'm an atheist, and with the other one, I just think they're unimportant, and so I would consider myself an agnostic in that respect. So if you sometimes epistemologists say that, raise the epistemic bar, so to speak, to these like skeptical kind of gods like the evil demon. But is that kind of covered?
Did you want to respond about how certain you are? Is there a number?
Oh, you want me to give a number figure for this? Within the subset of important gods, 95%. No more than that. It's hard to tell. I haven't really thought about this. And different numbers mean different things to different people. So I can't really give like a number and try to gauge how people might interpret that as well. So very high, I'm fairly certain. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? I'm staking a lot in my decision, so I hope that says that my credence levels are fairly high. Yeah.
All right, so this argument from disagreement, you notice that the first premise was that if God wants us to know, or that there should be with this kind of God, there should be no disagreement. That's essentially the first premise? Okay.
Or there is agreement. Make it simple.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let me go back to my first statement that this is a non sequitur. It does not follow that therefore God does not exist. But let me add an additional argument then that this is also a straw man, because this is not the view of Christianity, and you specifically addressed it as the Christian God. Christianity does not predict that everyone will agree about the existence of God. In fact, if you read the Old Testament or even the New Testament, there's quite a bit about all the doubting that is expected to go along, because God wants people to freely love him, not under compulsion. Certainty. So you're justified in being certain, and the gentleman who asked the question about thinking that there is no evidence either way, that is where I was stuck. So I was, Paul grew up in an evangelical believing situation. I grew up in a agnostic believing that there just wasn't evidence. I don't know who ever told me that. I just know that ever since I thought about the question, I believe that there was no evidence either way. And I assume that I somehow absorbed that from the community. But since I have been exposed to very strong arguments, and I hope that tonight I gave you very strong arguments to believe that God exists, I think that I am justified in believing that God exists at least as certainly as the arguments. So for the argument from the beginning of the universe, somebody didn't turn their cell phone off. All right.
I was using it as a timer.
So this is a syllogism that as long as the two statements are true, the conclusion must follow. Okay? If the two premises are true, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, I know logically, therefore, my conclusion is also true. So I am as certain as God exists as I am certain of those premises, which I feel are very strong, that anything that has a beginning has a cause, and the universe had a beginning. Those things, to me, seem irrefutable, and that's just one of the arguments. There are many, many more, and we only talked about 3 tonight, or 4, but I believe there's probably 20 plus just as strong as that. So I don't give a number. Is it 95, 99? I have no idea what the percentage is, but I can say I am certain that God exists.
You reference Matthew 7:7 quite often. You reference the first half of it. Right. You said, and I'll repeat Matthew 7:7, the portion that you mentioned several times. Ask and it shall be given unto you. Seek and you shall find. That's King James.
Whoever seeks finds.
Right. I can see you've done quite a bit of seeking. You've gone from seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking and seeking. The second part, knock and it shall be opened unto you. What have you done to wait for the door to be opened unto you? Instead of just going around seeking, knocking on door to door to door.
So this is very open, and so that I know exactly what you're talking about. Can you say what an example might be?
Like, okay, so instead of saying, ooh, I'm looking for the God of Christianity. Oh, he's not answering. I'm going to look for the God of Islam. I'm going to look for whatever Buddhism teaches. I don't. Instead of just, I'm not sure how good this question is, but what have you done to wait for the door to be opened unto you? That is my question.
Okay.
In the God of Christianity.
I'm still waiting.
My question would be for Keith, and it was, how do you justify a benevolent and omnipotent God as with evil in the world? Because if he's all-powerful, he has the power to stop all of the evil in the world. He has the power to stop Satan. However, he hasn't. So wouldn't that therefore make him not benevolent as an evil God, which counteracts the stereotypical Christian God?
All right, so the problem of evil is a big issue, and probably is a strong argument on the atheist side. So it seems that these things don't go together, right? If God is all-loving and God is all-powerful, if he's all-loving, he doesn't want us to suffer, right? And if he's all-powerful, then supposedly he can do something about it, right? So it appears that suffering then in the world seems to be contradictory, and therefore maybe this kind of God doesn't exist, or some variation. Maybe he's all-powerful, but he's not all-loving. or he's all loving, but he's not all powerful. All right. So first, I think that we should recognize that in making this very argument, what we're saying is that we recognize that there are things that are truly wrong. There are things that are truly evil. People do things that are really reprehensible and ought not to occur. So that to me confirms that we do know that morals exist, right? There are really things that are morally wrong. And I think that that is evidence that God does exist. So the mere fact that we are the kinds of creatures that notice these things and recognize these things means that there is a God who told us, who gave us moral duties and values, and that we have the ability to recognize these. So the answer that Christianity gives is that God initially created a world in which there was no pain and suffering, but that because God created man as a free will being, that he chose to disobey God, to separate himself from God, and that affected man and the entire creation. So that while it may be temporarily the case that God has chosen not to set things straight, that he will set things straight and he will punish evil. And so he will make things right again, is the Christian response to this dilemma. It's not that God isn't doing anything about evil in the world and therefore doesn't exist, but that God is refraining from doing evil so that free will creatures will have an opportunity to repent from their evil so that they will not be punished, and in the future he will punish the evil and set things right. So that to me, the very fact that you can ask that question shows you know instinctively that God actually does exist.
All right. So there are three things I'd like to say in response very quickly. One, starting with the problem of evil and asserting it doesn't mean that you also assert that there is evil. You could be pointing out a logical contradiction, an internal contradiction to the Christian worldview. So you could say that within the Christian worldview there's evil, but also within the Christian worldview you would predict there's not evil. All right? So you're not committing yourself to assert that evil actually exists. Second, there are lots of non-theistic theories for the existence of morality and ethics. You have virtue ethics and Rawlsian contractarianism, Deweyan ethical pragmatism, utilitarianism. There are a variety, and there are a variety of metaethical theories that accompany them. I hope that everyone, if you have the chance for the students, take a couple ethics courses. I'm sure they have some in the philosophy department here. And see that, if God, then morality, if no God, then no morality is false in and of itself. So there are other theories of where we say, yes, there is evil, and assert that there is while also asserting the problem of evil. I forget the third point now. Oh, man. Yes, with the issue of free will, the importance of free will. Another problem not addressed, which is much more powerful than merely the existence of evil, is the existence of natural evil, which free will does not cause. Why do we still have earthquakes? Why are there so many diseases? Why do little babies, how does little 3-year-olds getting cancer help them to make a decision, and so on and so forth. So there's free will only gets at the easiest and most superficial types of evil that exist.
So I'm addressing this question to Paul. And in your argument, you quoted Romans chapter 1, verse 20, which states, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse." But the statement does not end there. It ends with a colon in this case, which the clause still continues. So verse 21 says, "Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened." So my question for you is, if man had the capacity to create a God in their head, would they also have had the capacity to explain away God?
Okay. I wish I had quoted that one as well. I think it really helps my argument. The verse starts off with knowledge of God for these people that deny them. Before they denied God existed and made other gods or whatever else, they knew God. I wish I had, so I could quote it more directly. So again, it starts off with knowledge of God, the kind of bare minimum. Keith has, consistently kind of created a straw man in my position, saying that, clobbering or giving no choice in the matter or whatever else. But, I've consistently said that what we minimally need to exercise our free will, going back to the problem of suffering, of evil, to exercise our free will, we need to be fully informed of the choices. You can't choose between two things if you don't know what they are. You can't be said to have chosen what's inside the mystery box. You chose the mystery box. You didn't choose what's inside. Why? Because you weren't fully informed about the choice. So we need minimally to be informed to be able to make a choice, to be able to exercise our free will. You don't need to be clobbered with facts or the other hyperbole that have been mentioned. So thank you very much.
Well, I'm not sure I can add much to that. I think the question, if I understood it right, is that Paul set up a scenario where there were all these options of different gods, and why not? So Tori's asking, why can't it be that no God is just one of those options also? And so therefore would be in the same position as just one of the choices. It seems to me that that's a possibility, so it kind of negates the force of the argument.
I explained why humanism, the humanist worldview, explains the problem of disagreement in a way that other alternatives can't.
Okay, all right. Let me then just address a little bit what Paul said about the problem of moral evil versus natural evil. So if you recall, I said that in the Christian worldview, man has separated himself from God, and essentially God has allowed man to take control of his own destiny, take control of the earth as its ruler, and has been pushed out of the world. So whereas before he walked personally with Adam and Eve in the garden, had a personal relationship with them, which is what he wants from the beginning, man said, no, I'm going to do things my own way. And when you push the source of life and goodness and out of the world, the result is that the world starts to fall apart, and death and decay and tornadoes and cancer and things come to this world because the one who can hold it together has been shoved out by our rejection of him. So Christianity teaches that this world will literally fall apart to the point where God finally steps in and judges the world, with each man according to what he has done.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Why not?
I'm going to ask a question. So you say that this world is falling apart and natural evil is caused by moral evil. So earthquakes and syphilis and bubonic plague, all these things were caused by like homosexuality and whatever other things are evil. Like is that what you're saying? No. All right, so explain it a little bit. And then I'll follow.
No, so the argument would be that
And I asked the question so I get a rebuttal.
why not? So the answer would be that no. What I'm saying is that natural evil stems from the absence of God's controlling influence and presence. Okay, so we have essentially pushed God out by rebelling against Him, rejecting Him, essentially taking over. And so God is allowing us to experience what it is like without His presence. And this is what it is like for a God who created the universe, finely tuned, designed to be a perfect and beautiful habitat for free will beings to experience relationship with Him. We chose not to do that. So He is letting us, just like the parent who allows the child to disobey and touch the hot stove. I told you not to do that, but I'm going to allow you to experience what happens when you don't follow me. So it's not caused by our evil.
Yeah.
In fact, our evil continuing is actually another result of pushing God away.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I was hoping you'd say that. Great. So he used the example of a child, right? God allows this evil to happen the same way that we would, allow a child to, burn their hand on the stove, for instance. This is something that helps us on our path. It's formative. It helps us with our character. It helps us to, realize our, provides meekness, realize our helplessness and our reliance on God. There's lots of classic Christian explanations, and it sounded like most of them were touched on. But this doesn't explain lots of situations where that character development and all that kind of stuff isn't provided for. For instance, when I mentioned, and I was hoping you'd actually respond to this part too, a 2-year-old gets cancer and dies. They never got a chance to exercise the free will that it's constantly relied on is so important. All this evil stuff that's happening is happening because free will is incredibly, incredibly important. God really wants us to use this free will to form a relationship with Him, but yet gives a 2-year-old cancer before it can exercise free will. And similarly, how does someone learn from an earthquake in which the building collapses on them and they die immediately? There's no opportunity for character formation. Maybe it helps their relatives, but what do you do if all their relatives are in that same building? And the entire town collapses, and no one around them is able to similarly gain from that tragedy. So there's, again, I want to say there's different replies to this. Part of my talk has been that these are extremely, extremely complicated issues, right? And that we can go back on this, I'm sure, with the classic replies. We've only gotten into the classic replies for a lot of these discussions. I say this, and he says that, and I say this, and he says that, and you can go back and forth for a while. Really difficult. And I hope that, I'm not sure, I might only get a chance to say this once more. Yeah, but I hope that the difficulty of this situation lends to the problem of disagreement I was talking about. Okay.
Well, thank you guys for having this debate, and it's late, so I'll be quick. But I won't come up here and try and convert either of you, because I think the neatest thing is that we get to do this. Today, there was an attack in Kenya, for those who don't know, on a school, and Christians were singled out and killed. We live in a beautiful country, and I think this is awesome that we can have this debate. So I continue to encourage you guys to do this more and defend the ability for all people to get up and talk about this. I will die for my right to disagree with you. Absolutely. So my question goes along those lines. What are you each doing to defend the rights of others to believe that there is a God or there isn't a God? We talked a lot today about disagreements, and like I said, we should be a great melting pot, honoring and respecting each other's disagreements. Christians do disagree on a lot of things. Muslims do disagree on a lot of things. Jewish people disagree on a lot of things, as do atheists. But yet they've all reconciled that question of whether there is a God. Even atheists, you would say, have reconciled that question, whether there is a God. So at some point, they've reconciled that. And how are you each going to work to defend the rights of us to continue in this country, not to see what's happening in other countries where we're not able to do debates like this anymore?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I hope that I'm doing enough. What I am doing is I am presenting a opportunity for students at this university to come together to a club called Ratio Christi, where students from all faiths can honestly, openly examine and ask these questions. I think that we have to maintain that kind of belief in openness and the search for truth. I believe that God wants us to search for truth, and therefore wants us to be open and to allow people to freely choose, but also wants us to use the mind that he's given us, wants us to use the intellect to examine evidence, to use logic, to use reasoning to come to him. So, yeah, if there were more that I knew I could do, I vote every year, so.
Good job, Keith.
So education is actually incredibly important to me. I've worked internationally with schools in India, Bosnia, Kenya, in fact, in northern, central, and western Kenya, in Uganda and Indonesia. I've did my master's dissertation in sociology of education, where I studied religious conflict in education, religious identity formation, and its use in post-conflict situations and curriculum. I did my field research in Bosnia, and I helped work with a religious education curriculum there. So there's a difference between religious education and religious instruction. Instruction is what you get at Sunday school, like, it brings you up in one particular worldview, where education shows you in a more secular way, almost. So this was incredibly important in Bosnia in the post-conflict situation, where all the children were going to, Bosniaks going to Bosnian schools and Croats going to Croatian schools. And so having a common religious education curriculum was something that I helped work on very, very briefly, but also focused a lot on my dissertation. And I've since worked in research positions at the UN with the NGO Committee for Freedom of Religion and Belief, and with the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy in DC. And at the latter, I worked with a large research project, comprehensive research project of the schools and madrasas, in Pakistan, and how they represented outgroups. And published that with the USERF, United States Center for Interreligious Freedom. Connecting the Dots is the research report if you want to read that. And at the UN, I've done lots of reports and helped put together a website, which still hasn't gone up, but hopefully someday. Helped put together a website that would help people report on abuses of freedom of religion and belief from around the world. By the way, for the past two presidents of that NGO committee have been humanists and atheists. The reason I gave this talk, so this is something that's been incredibly important to me and something that I've worked a lot on in my career. And the reason why I gave this particular talk about the problem of disagreement is because, as I said, humanists would expect disagreement. It's something that, these are incredibly difficult issues. And we have limited experience and faculty's reasons, so we expect people to disagree. And I mentioned that I hope this fact inspires humility in people, that this is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. And that, hopefully you won't be as sure that you are about your particular religious beliefs. And I hope that stepping down and looking at the other person and seeing that they do really honestly believe that, they're not, your particular worldview hasn't been, quote, clearly seen, and that, you can, that will promote a little bit more peace and tolerance. And that's explicitly why I gave this talk tonight on this particular problem. And so that is a bit of what I've done towards this goal.
At this point in time, we've heard many of the arguments for and against, and the two individuals have done a remarkable job. Can we please give them a round of applause? And once again, I wanted to thank Dominic and the organization for putting this program together. It is very much needed. The benefit of living in a free country is that we are able to believe in what we would like to believe, and at the same time disagree. And I think that is one of the benefits. I think that each of us carries our faith or lack of faith, each to our own. So with that said, once again, a round of applause for the two of them. And I believe Dominic has some closing remarks.
Just a couple closing remarks. And first, thank you very much, Thomas. As was said a couple times tonight, this debate was hosted by Ratio Christi. So we meet at 7 o'clock on Thursday nights in F204 for this semester. We'd love to see you guys out there. You guys coming is what we do this kind of stuff for. We'd love to see you all there. We love questions. We'd love to continue the conversation with you. Yeah. So with that, the debate is closed and over.